Okay, I'll just get going. So welcome back, everyone. It is Friday. We're on day 5. It's been a journey, quite a learning experience for us. And we hope for you too. That was the point. So we hope there's been learning all around. Thanks again for coming back. Or if it's your first time tuning in, that is also fine. Anything that you missed is on YouTube. And so we'll today, and I'll send that out later. And there's nothing special today, breaking out or whiteboards or anything like that. You can just sit back and relax more or less. We'll have our few presentations to start. Then we'll do Q&A in the afternoon. If you have a question, put it in the chat. We will be monitoring that and we'll get to whatever we can. Or when we get to that stage, you can use the raise your hand or unmute yourself or whatever. We'll try to keep it pretty casual. And to start today, we just want to go through what this week has been and kind of reflect a little bit. And I have a little table here that the top part is what we were hoping to focus on during the week. And then we've pulled some key takeaways from our own perspective from all the breakout rooms that we had and the presentations that were given. So I'll just talk through this a little bit quickly. Monday, anyone who was here started looking at actually, we didn't start looking at much that day. That Monday was presentations. So we didn't do a breakout Monday. We wanted to go through the basics first. So there was an underlying understanding of what we're trying to get at. So we had Tina from East Coast Environmental Law, who will be back later today, talk to us about liability stuff, lawyer things. And then we had Joel, who was talking to us about the climate science things, and he'll be back as well. So we got that introduction in the first part of the day. And then we did a similar presentation to this really, where we talked about the focus of each day. So after that, listening to both Joel and Tina, we learned that we know some stuff, but we don't know a lot of stuff. And we generally have an idea of where things are going. And that's pretty clear in a lot of ways, but we don't know the details as well. So for example, we know sea level rise is going to happen, nothing we can do about it, but how quickly that happens and to what extent depends on what the glaciers do and all these things that we can't predict with a lot of certainty at this time. So that's an example and basic overview of what Monday was. Tuesday, we got into our first breakout sessions and we wanted to identify vulnerabilities in this fictitious town that we developed for this workshop. So hopefully that was a good exercise for anyone who had never done that before, or even if you have done vulnerability assessments before, we hope it was useful either way. And after we identified vulnerabilities, we started to think about how we would quantify the risk for those things. And after we did those sessions and came back and did our report backs, what we found that was kind of common throughout the groups was the interconnectedness of these separate issues that were identified. So a lot of the time, and we kind of built this in on purpose as well, of course, because it is true that what's happening in one area of a municipality or an area almost always has an impact elsewhere. So we wanted to tie that in. Similarly, one event can have cascading impacts much beyond, if a piece of infrastructure is damaged or something. Usually a lot more happens after that than just repairing that thing. Something else has been affected, often that increased costs and time to get back to what things were before. So that's an important thing to think about. And then something else that came up when we were doing that risk evaluation exercise, there were never very clear answers, and people might have had different thoughts about how severe something might be or the likelihood, because that data that we have is not certain. So we have to make some judgment calls when we're trying to make these decisions. Wednesday, we moved into engineering solutions and lack thereof, depending on the issue we're talking about. And we wanted to focus on how when we're making these sorts of analyses and trying to figure out solutions, we really need a lot of people at the table, not just engineers, but the staff people from the towns, residents in those towns. A lot of engagement needs to happen to figure out what is best to do. And then other key takeaways, similar to the interconnectedness part of the previous day, we realized we really need to approach things with a systems lens. Putting in one piece of infrastructure in one place might address one aspect of the issue, but if it's put in place without thinking about upstream or downstream, you could still end up with issues. So you really have to take a step back and find a solution that integrates with these other pieces. Function stacking is something we noticed, and that's kind of a jargony term if you're not talking about this kind of stuff a lot. But basically, how can we use an engineering solution to do more than one thing at once? So if we have a stormwater problem, can our stormwater solution address the stormwater, but also help us with some of the other vulnerabilities we're seeing? One example that came up, we had this area that had a higher fire risk than others, and also had a water access issue. So could we somehow use stormwater collection to act as like an emergency water storage thing for the fire? Stuff like that. Is there a way that we can do more than one thing and kind of make our money go further when we make these infrastructure investments? And also, when we were trying to talk about engineering solutions, our minds often went to planning and policy solutions faster in some cases, or it was very easy to see how we can do an engineering thing, but we're going to have to do a policy thing as well. So we have to have plans, contingency plans, emergency plans, even though we're doing our best to prevent that stuff with these engineering solutions. Thursday, yesterday, we came back around to planning and policy more directly, and tied that in with concepts of eco-asset management. And green infrastructure did come up the previous day as well, because that can still be considered an engineering solution. But they can also be green infrastructure, conservation areas, stuff like that is also related to policy and planning. And in general, we noticed that you can't make any of these types of decisions these days really without thinking about climate change in an effective way. So you can, people of course still do, but to be effective and sustainable and resilient, there has to be that climate lens on everything. It's just so interconnected now, and the challenges are so big that we really have to have it top of mind all the time. So as we were talking about the planning stuff, community engagement, of course, came up as something that was really important, because we're talking about these often significant changes, and they're going to directly impact people who live in this area. So we have to know what they're thinking about that. And also the communication part also just helps to enable it at all, because there can be a lot of pushback a lot of the time, even for not climate related things, as many counselors know. And that kind of led into the next point I have here about tension. And there's tension in a few ways. What I just mentioned about just like decision makers making decisions with what some may perceive as not enough engagement, and there just being a lack of information sharing, that kind of thing. But also there's this tension between the responsibility that municipalities have to protect people and to make the quote unquote right choice for the greatest number of people, versus people's inherent rights to make their own choices about where they live and how they live and that sort of thing. So that was an interesting conversation. And throughout all of this, it really drove home the fact that this is interdisciplinary, these issues, we need to collaborate. And in some cases, what we want to do may or may not be aligned with what municipalities actually have authority to do. They have a lot of authority, but so does the province. So what kind of what lines are drawn in that way? Where is it both? Where do they both have to, where do municipalities and the province have to come together to do something? And in general, this is a whole systems thing, whole of society, whole of an organization. There can't just be a climate action committee that, you know, talks separately from everybody else. This is an every department type of situation. So that's what happened in a nutshell. And today we have our panel discussion about any of the topics that came up, and we have a few more presentations about now that we have this this general idea of how we do a vulnerability assessment and how we start to think about solutions. How do we prepare to implement those things? So how do we prioritize across all of these issues that are happening at the same time with limited budgets, limited capacity, all that stuff? How do we access money, plan to access money, try the best we can to get some money? How do we do that? And this engagement collaboration piece, how do we start? So that's where we were, where we are. And this is just a slide we had on Monday to hopefully we can look at this now and be like, yeah, okay, this is what happened. This is what we plan to do in terms of learning objectives. We hope that now, whether you were familiar with this stuff or not before, you're more comfortable looking at your own community or a community you've worked with and do this type of analysis and generally know where to go and what steps to take and what questions to ask yourself and others and who to bring in. And yeah, that is basically what happened. And I'm going to pass it to Ashley now to talk more about those things I mentioned: prioritization, funding, all of that.
Thank you, Emma. I am trying to get my presentation to share here now. So do the slideshow. Okay, and share the screen. All right, can everyone see my screen? Yep, excellent, thank you so much. So thank you, Emma. That was a good synopsis of the sort of key takeaways and points that we have looked at this week. And then, you know, you get to the week like this, end of the week, and you say, well, like, you know, what do we do now? And so we're going to look a little bit at some of the things that we have determined are very helpful in terms of getting to a next step. So I want to say thank you. If you're here today, thank you for coming. And if you've been with us all week, thank you for sticking it out. It's been an action-packed week for us, and I hope you folks, I echo Emma's thoughts there. So in terms of prioritizing a set of actions, I mean, we could probably have an entire week session just on tools for prioritization. I apologize, I've woken up sick. My son has given me whatever he had. But generally speaking, you sort of have to put it on a grid where you look at the criticalness of something, which may or may not be a word, I'm not sure, but just looking at that risk map that we were looking at. Is there a high level of consequence? Did anything end up in that red? Was there pieces of things that you can see as really critical or root causes, that kind of thing? And so that can be related to the risk. It can be related to resident expectation. It can be related to a lot of things. But the idea of how critical is that particular item. And then ease of implementation. And so ease of implementation can be related to time or money or resources, or, you know, like that's the concept of the low-hanging fruit, which may or may not always be where you want to start, but it is important to maintain momentum and get traction wherever you can. Sometimes ease of implementation just has to do with timing of funding programs, right? Like you kind of look at it that way. And then whatever kind of ends up in this quadrant of your map here are the things that you would sort of look to do first. And so roughly speaking, I'm addressing it at a high enough level that that may or may not be a sort of like a super useful tool, but it is helpful to sort of keep in mind those concepts. One of the frameworks that we have used when working with municipalities that we have found very helpful is looking at priority tiers instead of like really defined ranking about what is top priority versus lower priorities. And so the logic behind here, especially within the context of municipalities, is that there's a large dependency on funding that's available. And so when you're looking at trying to do these things, you don't want to have to be explaining to your constituents that you chose like number 4 on the list instead of number 1, right? That makes it a bit awkward. Whereas if you just say like, this is priority tier 1 and we're going to look for these things, then it's a much smoother explanation. It also helps, I find, to tie your project to a category of organizational shifting. So either an asset category or organizational change. Anyone who's familiar with FCM's like asset management readiness scale will be familiar with these specific categories, but it does help to add a category to the project so that as a municipality, you can show that you're addressing multiple categories of like your service provision. And that makes a stronger value argument when you're trying to apply for funding. Honestly, just having a table like this and having gone through this exercise puts you in a position that when you're writing a funding application, for example, you can say, like, we've done this analysis, we've looked at prioritization. These are our priority tier 1 projects. We're applying for this because it's one of our tier 1 projects, right? So you can see how the logical arc then holds across trying to implement the project. And so specifically, when you're looking at funding to get started, and in the context, again, of municipalities specifically, these are FCM programs, so Federation for Canadian Municipalities, if anyone's not familiar with the acronym. And then what I did here is I tied it to the 3 categories of activities that we had talked about, where you need mitigation, adaptation, and asset management, and you sort of pull all of those things together to have everything you need to know in one place. And so these particular programs, so you start with the GHG reduction pathway feasibility. So that's how you get greenhouse gas inventories and you develop science-based reduction targets. And this is funding that you can get specifically to do that. You look at all of your buildings within your community that are municipally owned or that the municipality has like a clear partnership with, sometimes not-for-profits or like, YMCA type organizations will own the building, but it's part of the community. And so oftentimes they can be included. FCM will make a judgment call about that partnership, but you can sort of look there. And then from there, you can look at the capital projects. So one of these has to do, they're slightly different when you get down to the details, but the idea is that you do a study, you identify how you're going to reduce emissions and increase energy efficiency in your buildings, and then you can apply for capital funding in order to achieve that. And this is a good way where you can get started with the mitigation. So the next one we looked at was adaptation. So again, FCM has one sustainable neighborhood action plan, it's called, but it does, when you expand this out, it actually does say that it can be for an entire community. They're trying to capture every community across a Canadian jurisdiction. So that runs quite a high gamut, as you might imagine. There's no way the city of Toronto is going to implement something across the whole thing for the fees that are here, but at the neighborhood level. And this one here, there is a focus on climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. And you can look at watershed management and watershed modeling within the context of this. And so this sort of also enables like a connection with asset management. It's not an asset management focused one, but you can make the connection quite clearly. And that there would be an opportunity to do quite a lot of stakeholder engagement with this. So this is funding that you can get to do the activities within that adaptation box category. And Kathleen's going to talk to us a little bit. The Fed's recently announced the National Climate Adaptation Strategy, and so we can we'll hear a bit more and whatever FCM decides to do with that funding. And then in terms of asset management, there is the FCM's Municipal Asset Management Program. I don't believe they have it open for funding right now in terms of specific projects, but I do know that you can get training and quite a lot of resources. So if you're sort of willing to go through a training program and build capacity and access the resources, that is all open right now. And I think if you bide your time a little bit, we'll probably see the funding open again, because the FCM is also making really clear connections between climate change considerations and asset management strategies. They're really connecting those two things. So that would be available there. The link is here if you want to see what training is available. I'm pretty sure it's either very low cost or no cost for municipalities to attend the training. And so it's worth looking into. And I put this one in here because funding is always one of those things where you kind of just have to keep your eye out, and you have to be, if you have that sort of category of priority tier projects and a category associated with them, you would be ready then to apply to something as it comes up. The Natural Resources Canada and Infrastructure Canada and Office of Climate Change provincially, programs come out sort of in timed rolling things. And so it's just a matter of kind of keeping your eyes open there. And then another way to sort of get started on things is to look at cohort approaches. So often FCM will give you higher levels of funding coverage if you apply as a cohort. So you could get 60% or something if you go as an individual, and 80 or 90 if you go as a group and you show. And that also helps share the cost, especially when neighboring municipalities or contiguous municipalities along a coast are facing much the same issues. You develop that strong peer relationship, and you can share the cost as a small municipality across, the group of you, as opposed to one individual municipality having to bear the weight of that all. It was discussed sort of several times, like the sort of regional approach, right? So even outside what is happening formally at a provincial level for regionalization, you can still take that mindset to some of the decision making. We had, I know we talked in our group about a neighboring marina that was maybe like newer, or was in better a better state of repair. You might then just partner and shift to move the industry up there, instead of having quite a lot of overhead maintenance of your own thing. So that sort of logic, the informal partnerships, where we're all kind of in this together, as it were, is available. And then there's specific partnerships within the industry and academia. These things are pretty well always open, I believe. So there's MyTax, where you can get a partnership with a university, often graduate student, to partner with you. And depending on it, they offer like, it's kind of funny to say there's a sale on funding, because it's like the inverse of what you would expect. But the MyTax will often like put things on like funding sales, where they'll give you 75 instead of 50. You just kind of have to be aware. Libby Carew is the name of the woman who represents Newfoundland and Labrador, and she is wonderful and engaging, and I would encourage anyone to sort of reach out just to maintain that connection for when the right time comes along for a good fit. There's the National Research Council, so NRC. There's often funding through those when you can partner with an industry partner, depending on what it is that you're doing. Same with the NSERC Alliance grants. There's often some opportunities there once you've created the partnerships to deliver on a project. And then as a place to get started with public stakeholder and engagement, we've talked about the 7 steps a couple times this week. And I would suggest that this is a very good place to get started. The document itself is very accessible. The resources do need to be updated a little, where this is a decade old, just from that section, but everything else in this document is still very relevant. It's a framework, it's a process, like we've been talking about. And you don't need a lot of technical expertise to access it, right? Anyone who's, where there's a will, there's a way kind of logic, that if you sit down and you can engage with folks, in a way that there's like honesty and building empathy among the stakeholders, you can get a very good quality and robust assessment using this tool. And you will hear from Sepper Khosravi a little bit later about Climate Atlantic. And Kathleen and I were discussing, I'm not sure, Kathleen, if that was online or offline, but essentially like Climate Atlantic becomes the updated resource section. And so it's sort of worth engaging with this and then engaging with Sepper and Climate Atlantic as well. And that is the end of my show.
Great. So Kathleen, you can share next. We'll move right along. So I'll actually take these first few slides and then Kathleen will go. So one thing we wanted to add in here was a little something about insurance because it came up as a question on Monday. And we don't have anyone on our core team that is an insurance person. We don't have inside information, but I did a quick Google search just to see what I could find. So if you can click the next slide there, Kathleen. So the couple of big insurance like industry associations have of course been thinking about this. And the Insurance Bureau of Canada website has a lot of resources on it, a lot of different reports. I just grabbed one screenshot here, but they have a bunch of stuff. And the Insurance Institute as well has this report. So I haven't read all of them, of course, but it seems like a great place to go if you're interested in reading about it. And there are also lots of more like not-for-profit research institutions that are looking at this as well. So here are just two that I found quickly. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, this report called Underwater, talks about insurance in there. And then this Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, which is based out of the University of Waterloo, has a flood risk report as well that talks about insurance. And next slide. And then what I came across that I did not know about is this recent bit of information. So the Government of Canada, as part of their adaptation strategy development, created a interdisciplinary task force on flood insurance and relocation. So that is nice and specific. I liked to see that. And this report was just released this past August. And it consists of evidence and information to support the development of a national flood insurance program and strategic relocation program. So I thought that was interesting, good to know. I didn't know they were like very seriously considering the National Flood Insurance Program. So I don't know details about it. I have not opened this document. I grabbed the screenshot for you and the links are there. And if you're interested, this seems like a good place to start reading about it. And as I mentioned, this ties to the National Adaptation Strategy, part of this big, I guess, overall initiative. And Kathleen will dive into this a bit further right now.
Well, as usual, I have to remember to unmute. Yeah, so brand new stuff, much awaited. There's been a solid year and a bit of consultations leading up to this. And you know, as you can see, these are sort of documents that come in tandem, sort of like municipal plans. We've got the strategy, which is the sort of overall, you know, sort of policy framing document, and then the actual action plan where we see a lot more of the gory details, if you will. The timeline in this instance is a kind of interesting one. You'll be, I imagine, starting to see a lot of this graphic popping up in relationship to the communications around these strategy as we move ahead. They've basically got an adaptation cycle that they've laid out in order to frame up the function of various parts of the strategy, and you know, give us a heads up on the stuff that's to come. Obviously, it's based at this stage in the game on all the climate science that has been done. You know, there's been many years now of research that's gone into that, several iterations of knowledge assessments that have been completed, and it's gotten through the vulnerability and risk assessments in the context of the nation as a whole. And so here we are, you know, with the National Adaptation Strategy actually crafted, pushed out to the public, And that basically marks the starting gate for the implementation. So as I referred to it, that adaptation action plan is where you can go for a lot more detail on exactly what that's going to look like. And of course, there's a whole evaluation metric that is encompassed in this exercise as well. So there will be measures. There are plenty of targets that are laid out in the strategy, and they will be assessing this on more or less a 5-year cycle. That's what gets framed up. You'll see that when you actually have a look at the documents yourself. But the actual iteration seems to have a little bit of wiggle room in there, because they're basically laying out a timeline right now where the adaptation strategy 2.0 is in 2030. So, oops. And the way then that they've got it structured beyond that, there are actually 5 key adaptation strategy systems, as they refer to them. We've been doing a lot of stuff this week that has examined things in terms of that interconnectedness and the systemic nature of the work that we're doing when we get into the adaptation space. So you'll see them there: disaster resilience, health and well-being, infrastructure, nature and biodiversity, and of course the economy and workforce that we need in order to advance. The federal roles and responsibilities are explained particularly in the action plan. If you go in there, you'll see all of the listicles that you can use to sort of cross-reference who's doing what under which of these categories. There are 21 of the federal government departments and agencies that are involved in this. Currently, there are 73 actions that are in the plan. And as I note, this is going to be an evolving exercise with a certain degree of ongoing evaluation. However, more or less a 5-year cycle on the revisiting of the action plans as well. You will also note that most of the projects are already existing when you go in there. A lot of the structure of how things are going to be delivered, of course, we've talked about, the necessity for coordination across levels of government. There are a lot of value statements in the document as well that recognize Indigenous governance and the role of Indigenous peoples in both the circumstances of communities with particularly unique and challenging climate adaptation issues, but also tremendous knowledge of the environment and a long-standing history of managing and living within it. Federal, provincial, and territorial agreements. We're going to be seeing a lot of the adaptation actions devolve through them. And then there is a series of sort of mainstreaming toolboxy type things, as I'm going to refer to them, knowledge and understanding pieces, more tools and resources, and governance and leadership supports. So what's actually new then? I actually picked my way through those 73 in one of the tables and pulled them out. And the ones that are bolded there are the ones that are actually flagged as being brand new money. The ones with the little pluses, they represent a topping up, if you will, of a prior project or expansion thereof. So you'll see right top of the list, the Wildfire Resilient Futures Initiative. A lot of things there tied to these circumstances, of course, that we've seen of increasing wildfire risks. The NRC, very recently, we understand from some of the presentations they gave our members at our conference earlier this month, a little bit more about some of the approaches that they're taking to sort of building code and design approaches and research on materials that are going to be rolling out. If we jump down, you'll see the supporting resilient infrastructure, definitely, Infrastructure Canada and a variety of partners there that are that are going to be looking at upping the standards around infrastructure. And very key, when you actually go in, and you can find more detailed descriptions of all of these in the text of the action plan. You'll see that it's not exactly fine print, but sort of down on the list, they basically say they're going to be holding all federal government funding to a higher standard now of climate resilience, a demonstration that the thought process has gone in to the process of the design and whatever the thing is that a community or entity is going to be applying for under those programs. So that speaks really directly to some of the things that we've been talking about here, and that the BRACE project has been pursuing, in order to ensure that professionals that are working with communities and developing and producing applications for capital works monies, are well equipped in order to be able to meet that standard of information in those submissions. More data. Big piece. We can expect to see a lot of gaps filled in that space, a lot more communications, and of course, advancing municipal adaptation action. This is the Green Municipal Fund infusion that we're seeing. So, certainly in my space and municipal sector, we're watching this one. And, it follows very much, in a line with other partnerships that the feds have had with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in order to provide adaptation capacity and capacity building more generally, capacity building around, skills, awareness, training, all of those things fit in that bucket with the FCM and the Green Municipal Fund. We'll be seeing a lot more of these sorts of announcements. More of the flood hazard mapping program. That's one that a lot of communities have a real interest in, getting their flood mapping data done. So, definitely looking forward to seeing some of that. We have, in terms of the strategy overall, they do make the point that although extreme heat is the most deadly of the vulnerabilities and climate change impacts that we're seeing currently, and hence some of the focus that we're seeing in the funding as a result, the flood circumstances are really the most pervasive and certainly among the most costly. So anticipate a lot more announcements to come in that space. And because we don't really have all of the details as yet on what the FCM might be doing with that money, perhaps what we can do though is kind of look at some of the conditioning factors on the municipal sector. Certainly the targets that are laid out on infrastructure are some fairly good indicators of the timeline we're looking at. Big emphasis on increased standards right across the board. Much more of an emphasis, by 2030 on ensuring that everybody is actually doing the climate adaptation analyses and working it into their final decisions. And then, of course, that resilient infrastructure funding. And I'll just point to that starting in 2024. And once again, that reinforcement of the funding programs, taking those climate change impacts into account. That very, very much aligns with the end of the current gas tax agreement. So, and I'll suggest to you that there's no coincidence there. The gas tax agreements have been something that communities have relied on for a number of years as some of the more liquid and less encumbered categories of funding in order to support a variety of applications and leverage other funds. So, and that process has been one that has been negotiated as federal, provincial, and territorial agreements, right across the country. So we're dealing in a national environment when we look at the progress of those agreements. They've all been stepwise advances on aspects of sustainability and best practice in the municipal sphere in particular. So if you think way back, early 2000s, it was the integrated community sustainability plans, which unfortunately in Newfoundland and Labrador had a pretty spotty experience because the province was not really providing a lot of support and guidance and pedal to the metal on that. So a lot of them wound up being done at the last minute in order to meet compliance with that agreement. And a real opportunity was lost because elsewhere in the country, we saw the integrated community sustainability plans as being products that are now actually, they've continued. Other municipalities have in fact been renewing theirs on a 5 to 10 year cycle. So a number of them are into second and third iterations. We had some harmonizing of accounting standards under the prior gas tax agreement, and then this asset management agreement, this last gas tax agreement, has been undertaken with a very significant partnership on the FCM side in order to ensure that there was in fact the training needed in order to get communities into this space. It's not that they weren't managing assets before, but they weren't doing it in a data-driven fashion. They weren't, sort of looking at it as an all-of organization undertaking. And that very much connects with the kind of thought process, the kind of organization that we're very much looking to see in this larger context now of addressing climate change adaptation challenges and making more resilient communities. So the name, I think, has yet to be applied to this one, but I think this is the old acknowledgement slide that M&L has been using for the last 4 or 5 years as we were also implementing partners to the municipal asset management program, and I expect we'll be using acknowledgement slides like this again as part and parcel of the rollout of whatever the GMF project outcomes from the FCM side are going to look like. And I'll just close off with a few questions because certainly, for the municipal sector in Newfoundland and Labrador, yes, we're curious about what these new programs are going to look like, but we're also very curious about what the bilateral agreement is going to look like, for the next gas tax agreement. And you'll note that I've crossed it out because they've actually rebranded the gas tax last year. So it's now the Canada Community Building Fund. And that's something that M&L is very anxious to be at the table in the negotiation of. We have other municipal and provincial associations across the country that actually do administer the gas tax agreements for their jurisdictions. So this is something that our organization is interested in doing, so that some of the approaches are not sidelined by other government priorities. But it does also beg the question for us right now, particularly in respect of asset management, about the fact that we still have a large number of our communities that have not gotten in the game. So in effect, they could be starting behind the start line yet again, and we really can't have that happen. So we've got a year left. The deadline on having the asset management planning underway was meant to be this coming March. But effectively, there's always an admin cleanup year. So we can put a big push on, I hope, in the next little while to close the gap on some of those things. And perhaps we'll discuss that a little bit more in the panel later on. Anyways, I better toss to Joe right now because he's got a few things he wants to say.
Thanks, Kathleen. Well, first off, so I have to leave a little early, so I won't be able to attend the full panel discussion. So just FYI, if you have questions for me, please, I can do that early. I have to go to my class, which is at 11. I want to thank everybody that has attended, and let everybody know that I learned quite a bit here, so it was really useful for me. I hope it was useful for you. I also want to thank Fundamental for all their work, and if I can single out one particular person, that would be Emma, for the great job she's done and all the work. So I this is our final workshop for this NRCan project, and this is not an indication of anybody else, but by far Emma has exceeded everything anybody else has ever done with these workshops. So, and that's not a slide on the other workshops. It's just a testament to Emma and how well she's done. Thank you so much for all that. I do want to end my bit. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will come through okay. Okay, so everybody should see, here you see the full slide there that says ASCE call to action. Okay, so just, I'll be very brief. In my view, you talk about mainstreaming, climate change, climate action, all needs to be mainstreamed. It has to be part of the process, not an addition, where we're also trying to incorporate climate change. It needs to be there and embedded within the entire process here. And everybody's got their role to play, and as an engineer, I think to all, especially to all, speaking directly to all you other engineers on this that are present here, is that we can do a lot here. It's like we have a lot to contribute to this, and so the ASCE call to action. So ASCE is the American Society of Civil Engineers. This call was actually done, this whole there's several books, one in particular about sustainability. That's the ASCE works with CSE, which is the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, on this. So CSE has been involved in this. So this is a North American thing, and parts of this is also branching out to other parts of the world as well. But this is, again, directed to civil engineers, and I want everybody to see this. So that the argument goes, whereas civil engineers provide essential infrastructure, and that infrastructure is inadequate or dangerously deteriorating, and that's of course much more the case with climate change. We're seeing inadequate and deteriorating infrastructure, and the availability of resources and future conditions are uncertain. So it's saying that our current approaches and practices on standards, aren't addressing the full range of societal needs. And I think, that's kind of come out in a lot of things we've done. So that's kind of where we are, and is that our traditional approaches are not adequate to the task. So the conclusion is, therefore, civil engineering practice must be transformed. And there's call for a paradigm shift, and that's, well, that could be vague, but the real point there is that we need to change how we think about this as engineers moving through, and this is where mainstreaming is important. It needs to be there from the get-go. My position at Memorial, I've tried to bring this into our program. It's been challenging, but this needs to be there, and this is one of the ways to do it. ASCE has taken on the lead in this, and again, this doesn't preclude any other contributions. And again, CSCE is a big part of this, and a lot of great work, of course, being done in Canada, as you've seen, and in a lot of ways we're ahead of the United States in a lot of this. But the overall goals here are to transform how infrastructure is conceived, delivered, and operated. So this, I think, part of what we're doing here is that, in my vision, we're trying to do things differently by engaging communities and municipal folks and with the technical engineers and things like that. Number two is ASCE established wants to be a trusted leader, which is great. Then there's the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, the Envision program, which is, we haven't talked about that, but that's another aspect within the engineering discipline that's been doing a lot of important work with climate change. But for me, the big key here and the big goal is number 4, to expand the capacity of civil engineers to create relationships of trust and respect. And I hope that this workshop is at least makes some contribution to that, because I take this call to action seriously, and I hope others do as well. So that's it. I'm off my soapbox, and thanks again, and hopefully I will see you all in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. We have one quick extra message from a guest that you haven't seen yet. So we have Sydney Snow. She is I should know a more specific description for her. She's at MUN and working in sociology, I believe. She will discuss that now, who she is and what she has to say to us. So hi, Sydney.
Hi, Emma. Yes, so technically, so I'm a research intern with Conservation Corps NL. However, it's kind of is like I'm at MUN and kind of not, because I'm being supervised by Dr. Martin Day in the social psychology department of Memorial University. So generally what I talked to Emma about coming on here today to talk about. So Dr. Day and I are working on a survey that focuses on factors that affect climate change opinions in like Atlantic Canadian communities. So really what I'm here today is just explain the survey a little bit and just ask that you consider participating in the near future. So the survey itself looks at the opinions that like Atlantic Canadian decision makers, so individuals involved in climate change decisions in their community. So if you were to participate in the survey, you'd be asked to complete like a series of questions about your opinions on climate change and adaptation, including but not limited to potential actions, opinions, costs, and benefits associated with climate change adaptation. And of course, there'd be some background characteristics or demographics. But in general, the reason why I'm here is it would help us greatly if you participated, but it could also help you as well, because we'll be preparing a report based on the findings that we can share once it's completed. And the purpose of this research is less for an academic reason and more so that we can generally understand the actual process of adaptation and the factors affecting it in these communities. So it'd be very applied to the actual settings. So they'll likely be relevant to you and your communities, as well as just provide a general understanding of climate change adaptation. If that's not enough of an incentive, we'll also be offering every participant in that completes the study an entry into a draw to win one of 25 Tim Hortons gift cards, which are valued at $20 each. If any of this sounds appealing at all, then we're going to be sending out recruitment emails in the next couple of weeks following this workshop. And so should all have a subject line, something similar to like NL opinions on climate change and adaptation. So of course the survey is voluntary. You don't have to do it if you really don't want to, that's fine. But again, it would be really beneficial to us if you took the few minutes that it will take to participate. I think that's all, all the details really for now. Any more specific things such as links or survey instructions would be sent with the recruitment email later on. But of course, if anyone has any questions about it at this point, they're feel free to ask, or they can also contact myself, Sydney Snow, or Dr. Martin Day, and we could address them at that point through email.
Perfect.
That sums everything up.
Great. Yeah, that's perfect, Sydney. And we'll be sending this email she's talking about and links and stuff. We'll send it out to you because I have all your contact information from registering. Yeah. So we will do that. And when you see that come along, it'd be great if you could open it, have a peek, and see if you have time to do that. So
that'd be great.
Yeah, great. Thanks for coming on to tell us that, Sydney. And I think now we'll take, I think we're at 7-minute break now to start our Q&A at 10:30. And yeah, we hope you come back for that. If you have questions in your mind, you can start writing them in the chat so that we can compile them. And yeah, we'll be ready for chatting in, maybe it's 6 minutes now, 6.5. Okay, see you soon again. Alrighty. Seems we have all of our panelists here. Joel and Tina are here, right on time. Perfect. Great, and Joe is hopefully still here as well for the first little bit.
I'm here.
Okay, good. We have your questions early in the queue, so you can take care of that before you go. All right, so first of all, what we wanted to give a couple of minutes to both Sapir and Marina, since you've all most of you have probably been in a room with them at some point over the last few days if you have been here all week, but they haven't really had a chance to say what they do or who they are. So we wanted to give them that chance at first. So you go ahead first, Sapir, and talk about you and Climate Atlantic.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much, everyone. Good morning. Yes, I've had this chance to talk to you folks during these past few days, and I'm glad to give you a brief overview of myself, my role, and Climate Atlantic. My name is Sapir Khosravi, and I represent the island of Newfoundland as Climate Services Specialist in Climate Atlantic. My host institution is Econex, formerly known as Newfoundland Environmental Industry Association, and I have been into this role since last year, October. Among the things I do are facilitate and support the readiness of Newfoundlanders and the stakeholders to adapt to climate change through communication, collaboration, and facilitating access to accurate climate change projections and the use of tools and resources. If I want to say a little more about the organization, I should say that the Climate Atlantic was created in June of 2021, just last year, through partnerships between Canadian Centre for Climate Services and all Atlantic provincial governments, as well as the Ecology Action Centre, New Brunswick Environmental Network, and Aster Group. For all the Atlantic provinces, Climate Atlantic facilitates access to regionally relevant climate information and data and supports its effective use in planning and decision-making. We are a user-driven organization focusing on different stakeholders, including Indigenous communities, academia, governments, municipalities, nonprofits, industry, and landowners. And Climate Atlantic efforts are being made to build a strong network of collaboration. This is something that I'm really, really passionate about and facilitate in developing tools and data. As some of you might know, our organization's mandate is climate change adaptation at the moment. And a little about our geographical spread, I should say that each of us is located in a different part of the Atlantic region. Our executive director, Sabina Dietz, resides in Sackville, New Brunswick, and every province has their own climate services specialist hosted by a specific institution. Our communication lead is Nicholas Carter. I think if you subscribe to our newsletter, you should receive his newsletter every month. And the engagement and knowledge mobilization lead is Janelle Frail. In addition, we have a data specialist. Unfortunately, he's leaving by the end of this year, Raul Daigle, and he's going to be replaced by our new data specialist, Emma Poir. We have a project coordinator, Cassandra, and she's been very involved in developing the map of networking map, and one communication intern that she just recently joined us, Emma Green. In addition, I would like to mention that we have just hired the Climate Services Specialist of Labrador. Her name is Willa Nilsson, and she is hosted by Labrador Campus. She lives in Happy Valley, Goose Bay. This is a very quick overview of my role and the organization, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much. And now that you have a better idea, if you have questions about any of that, put it in the chat and hopefully we'll get to it. Marina, you go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Some of you have seen me in the last couple of days, but my name is Marina Casali. I'm a second-year PhD student here at Memorial University in the Department of Geography, and I'm working on a project with Dr. Carissa Brown, Dr. Joe Darayo, and Dr. Joel Finnis, which are here today with us. And essentially, we are looking to address the issue of coastal erosion and loss of coastal habitat around the Avalon Peninsula, specifically here on the island of Newfoundland. And we're looking to address the problems of coastal erosion, specifically in smaller communities. And we want to look to give some solutions that are a bit more economically friendly for smaller communities. We've talked a lot about in the past few days, coastal erosion, sea level rise, and all these issues that are connected with work that Joel is doing, and he will provide a lot of data for us in this project, and also Joe, who talks a lot about infrastructure and specifically nature-based infrastructure and adaptation along these coastal communities. And essentially what we're going to be doing more in detail is looking for specific plants that are already here present on the Avalon Peninsula. And we want to kind of look for information on how well they grow, where we want to plant them, the best locations to plant them. Of course, this is not going to be a solve all solution, but we are looking to give some suggestions at the end of this project to local municipalities and also private citizens that might be interested in this kind of solution for their community. And yeah, so keep tuned. We'll see in the next couple of years when we start our field work and have a bit more results for you guys. But I will put in the chat a couple of links that are to our labs, Duraro's lab here in engineering in Memorial, and also Dr. Carissa Brown's lab here in geography. So I'll put that in the chat for you guys. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. And thank you for being here this week, guys. I learned a lot of stuff this week as well, you know, always learning new things.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so Joe, we will start with you, given your limited time. And we've saved some of the questions that we got throughout the week. So this question was actually from Wednesday. It was from Chris Patterson, who had to go today. So he won't hear his answer in real time, but he can read this, listen to this recording later. So his question was about watershed modeling and how we could reasonably, feasibly do that without having much regional governance or that regional structures right now. So can that be done as things are? And do you have any experience about things that, or I guess just explaining how you can do that?
Yeah. If I understand the question, when you take a watershed approach, of course, how you do the modeling for a particular community depends on the actual watershed, right? So often, communities either the watersheds extend well outside of the municipal boundaries and or include other municipalities within the watershed. So that kind of lends itself to cooperation and collaboration between municipalities. And in terms of how you do that is straightforward. But if the question is about funding and things like that, and how you can actually get that done, honestly, I think the approach that you're taking at Fundamental is with cohorts, and we've done some projects where we have multiple cohorts, multiple municipalities with either adjacent or shared watersheds to allow the municipalities to pool resources to get the models developed and run. I don't know really how else to answer that question. I mean, so one of the projects was it was FCM funded with the CCNL, and we used part of those funds were used to get my tax funding for the model development and model building. So there's a lot of flexibility in the funding mechanisms to get some of these. So that was effective because of a portion of that. So it kind of just a little more information on that. My tax, usually they do internships and up to 3 or 4 month blocks, and you can do several. You can have master students or PhD students over time, but in general, the 4 month internships usually are a total of 15,000, where the municipality or a group of them would need to come up with half of that, and my tax tops that up. And actually, I mentioned they do have specials sometimes that increase my tax input, but that allows to cover for graduate student stipend and salary and resources and travel and all other things. And from a funding perspective, anything that involves a kind of the research component or questions, which a lot of this does, that's the best way to do it. And it's actually quite efficient. Come through academia, because it's a lot, be a lot there's a trade-off because it's cheaper, but we're also training students, so sometimes it can go more slowly than a consulting firm because students need to learn how to all this stuff, and that's part of just the way it works, right? So yeah, I don't know if that, hopefully that answers Chris's question. And Chris, if you're listening right now on the recording, you know how to reach me if you have other questions.
Thank you, Joe. And yeah, I think like how I would summarize that quickly is, yes, you can still take a regional approach to your watershed modeling, even if the province hasn't defined what your region is. It doesn't have to align with that. You kind of have to look at just what your watershed is. It is what it is, and figure out who else is around that should be involved in doing that. And there's a way to figure it out. We have one other question prepped for you, Joe. I don't see anything else in the chat right now about that, but if you have anything, put it in there. My question, we've talked a lot about uncertainty all this week, and a common theme in the breakout sessions was that we felt we need to have more information in order to make decisions. But is the pursuit of data always the most important first step? So if a town has a limited budget, is investment in another study always the best idea? Should it always be the priority, or is there another approach we could be taking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's kind of, I think there's layers. First off, you want to get as much data as are available. If there's data available, you want to use it. It doesn't mean that the data are necessarily reliable, or there's any certainty in that data that may be there. However, there are lots of data, such all the climate data, all this, the uncertainty is understood, or at least known to some degree. And that's the key point. Is even if you don't have all the information, is understanding what you don't know allows you to make better decisions. And also, if on Wednesday I talked about different adaptation strategies, and long term, if you don't have that information at present, you can still go forward with what you have, understanding that there is uncertainty and you need to get more information that you can then hopefully will become present over the course of 5-10 years, say, even, where then you can then go revisit, because the adaptation is a process. It's a one-off. It's something that requires planning. And so in that respect, of course you want to have use whatever information's there. If it's not there, doesn't mean you can't go forward. It just means you have to know what you don't have, know what you don't know, and make your decisions on that. And it's quite frankly, it's no different than it's ever been, right? It's no matter, even with or without climate change, it's always been that way. It's just now we're faced. It's more obvious. The uncertainty is much more obvious and needs to be discussed, but in no way does it preclude any action at all. You just knowing what you don't know is still knowledge, and that's what matters.
Wonderfully said. I like that. Thank you. So Ashley, would you like a question next?
Sure.
Okay. So we had a question about asset management and how, Kathleen touched on this, but just, I guess, from your perspective, where can people go to figure out where to start? So maybe we're talking about small communities who haven't looked at it yet. Where are the resources, and is there funding? Just to confirm those things.
Yes, absolutely. So in my presentation, one of the slides showed the municipal asset management program. And so if you are community-based, not-for-profit, or a municipality, you can partake in those trainings. It does involve like you having to sort of dig in on your own at this point. We call it MAMP. It's maybe a weird acronym, but it's the Municipal Asset Management Program. The funding is not currently open, but I do expect that it will open again. So I'll drop the link from the presentation in the chat just to make it easy for folks. And FCM is a really great place to start. Even if you don't or aren't able to avail of their specific training programs, they actually have an incredible amount of resources and case studies and frameworks available that anyone can click on a link and get access to. So
perfect. Next on my list is a question for Tina. And this came through on Monday after your presentation. So I'll say the little intro stuff. There are some recent landmark court cases, Windsor Lake and Annapolis, where municipalities seem to have some responsibility for conservation area designation or watershed zoning. It was mentioned that larger policy decisions should not need to lead to constructive expropriation, but it would be very costly for municipalities if they have to buy out land that has been zoned conservation or watershed. So my first question was, can you define constructive expropriation? Because I had to Google it. After that, the question that came through from the audience on Monday was, what financial liability could municipalities be facing with respect to the need to purchase private property from the owners because of the risk that those properties are facing?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to the questioner for that question. I will answer both parts of the question as you've broken them down, but one thing that I do want to clarify up front, and then we can get into this, is that I didn't actually say in the presentation that the common law protection for core policy decisions could protect against liability for constructive expropriation. So that protective sphere that the law carves out is actually for negligence exclusively. So it's specific to the common law of negligence. And the legal frameworks and analyses that we talk about when we talk about constructive expropriation are different. So it is important to have that understanding. And if you're thinking about potential liability for constructive expropriation, which I'll define and explain in a second, it is important to keep in mind that policy carve out is not the same. It doesn't exist there. So important to have that in mind for sure. Getting to what constructive expropriation is, this is a phrase that goes by a couple of different monikers. So sometimes you'll hear the phrase constructive expropriation used. Sometimes you'll hear constructive taking. Sometimes you'll hear de facto expropriation. So you'll see maybe all three of those. They basically mean the same thing. It doesn't really matter except for the purposes of clarity and consistency and whatever you're reading. To explain what it is requires a bit of a step back, and we need to think about what expropriation is. So when we think about expropriation, particularly by governmental authority, what we're talking about is the taking of land by government. So lands that are privately owned and the taking of them by government or by governmental authority that's been empowered to take them. And most provinces, I think probably all, but I haven't looked to see for sure, but I would expect that all provinces and territories have expropriation laws of some kind. These are typically called the Expropriation Act or something similar. Newfoundland and Labrador has an Expropriation Act. Nova Scotia, where I'm located, has an Expropriation Act. And what these statutes do, what the laws do, is make clear government's power to take private land without a landowner's consent for governmental purposes. But they also typically included in that power to take, they set out a regime that sort of structures that taking and how the taking has to happen. And also they typically require that compensation be paid. And sometimes you see adjectives attached like fair compensation or reasonable compensation. It kind of depends on the statute, what you see. So typically it's those two things: confirmation of government power to take, and then also a requirement that compensation be paid. And then there's a whole scheme set out whereby the actual formal taking of title from the private property owner would be done, and title would be vested in the government or the government authority. So then constructive expropriation, or constructive taking or de facto expropriation, that is a situation where the common law in Canada recognizes that under some circumstances, it might be said that land use regulation or other kinds of laws are so restrictive that the government has in effect taken a private property owner's land, even though the land hasn't actually been formally expropriated under the expropriation scheme in the jurisdiction. And even though title still technically in law remains with the private property owner, still their name on the deed or whatever the instrument of title is, but effectively the government has taken the land. So it's basically a legal mechanism, a legal doctrine that says yes, the law, the courts will sometimes recognize that government has in fact taken your land, even though on paper they haven't taken your land under the formal regime. So that's what it is. And so then the second part of the question, which has to do with how legal doctrine around constructive taking intersects with zoning. I mean, it's a really complicated area of the law, but there has been some recent development in the case law that has changed things a little bit. So that Annapolis decision in particular is a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada on part of a dispute between the Halifax Regional Municipality, which is the municipality in which I live, and a development corporation called Annapolis Group, I think, something to that effect. Essentially, I mean, the legal dispute between the municipality and Annapolis is complicated, and there's a whole lengthy history behind it and lots of nuances and ins and outs and funny little quirks about it. But I mean, part of it has been an allegation that the HRM has effectively constructively taken Annapolis lands by zoning them in a way that prohibits future development. When the case went to the Supreme Court of Canada made some, what some would call changes, what the Supreme Court called clarifications to the law that I think will change the application of the law going forward in some ways, but it's also not clear to what extent it'll actually have major effects and like sort of negative ripple effects on the ground. A lot is going to depend on how lower courts actually apply the Supreme Court of Canada's decision. And so again, like this is a pretty complicated area of the law. There's a bunch of case law feeding into it. So just a couple of points I'll make at a high level with respect to how municipalities might want to think about this and approach this. I mean, Canada's common law has for a long, long time been very clear on the fact that under ordinary circumstances, zoning, whether you're doing down zoning or up zoning, zoning does not in and of itself constitute a taking. And so the law has for a long time recognized that quite a lot of restrictive land use regulation is the norm in Canada, and zoning up or down doesn't necessarily mean that the government has taken your land and then therefore needs to compensate you for it. That I don't think has been disturbed by the Annapolis decision from the Supreme Court of Canada. I still think we have a really robust history in the case law where that recognition has been established. And I don't think that the most recent decision in question here really interferes with that. Where the Annapolis decision makes a little bit of changes has to do with the actual common law test for constructive taking. I mean, the test, it has two parts, and those two parts remain the same, but the court added some sort of clarifications or qualifications that could very well change interpretation. But basically the two parts are that, you know, in order for a private landowner to prove in court, like to succeed in proving that their land has been constructively taken by government, and that therefore government, including a municipality, has to compensate them for that taking, like, you know, particularly if the taking has happened through like zoning that restricts their development vision, for example, they've got to prove two things. One is that the authority, so let's say a municipality, whatever governmental authority imposed a land use regulation that has restricted the private property owner's rights, the private property owner needs to prove that that authority has acquired a corresponding beneficial interest in the land. That's the part of the test that was qualified a little bit by, or some would say a lot, by the Supreme Court of Canada in the Annapolis decision. It had previously been interpreted to mean that basically the government needed to acquire a proprietary interest in the land. They even though the actual formal title hadn't been transferred, the courts were saying up till this point, no, you actually need to have basically acquired a property interest in the land. It's like you now own the land, basically. The Supreme Court of Canada said that the beneficial interest can be interpreted as an advantage. An advantage is a much broader, more nebulous concept. It could conceivably mean a lot of things apart from a proprietary interest. So that's created an open door, I think, that will maybe lead to more private property owners trying their hand at getting compensation for de facto expropriation or constructive taking. So still unclear what the results of those challenges might be, but certainly I think it opens the possibility to seeing more litigation, more folks trying to make attempts to get compensation for downzoning, for example. But then the other part of the test still matters and is still really relevant here. And the second part of the test is that the private property owner, to prove constructive taking, has to prove to the satisfaction of the court that the land use regulation in question, so the downzoning or whatever, has removed all reasonable uses by the landowner of the private property. And again, the Supreme Court of Canada made some clarifications or changes that will also contextualize that, but the fact still remains that what the courts are looking for is a situation where land use regulation, downzoning has taken away all of the private landowners' kind of rights to land or reasonable uses of their land, in effect, even though not necessarily on paper. So when we're thinking about the ways in which municipalities could be affected by zoning for conservation purposes, I mean, certainly this is an area of the law that creates potential risk and liability, but it's also one where success by private landowners is not guaranteed. And I think the reality right now is that the most recent decision from the Supreme Court of Canada has introduced, I would say, a lot of uncertainty into the law rather than a decisive, we don't necessarily have a decisive situation where municipalities are now more at risk than ever before of being taken to court for downzoning or refusing to allow development. But certainly I think it's created more risk because it's opened a door that I think some developers and other private property owners will try to get through in order to get compensation for downzoning. So there is that. Then the other thing I would say to that, then just to conclude, and I know I've spoken for a long time and I apologize, it is a complex area of the law. The court, the Supreme Court of Canada in the Annapolis decision was very clear, and the law before now has always been very clear, that municipalities and other governmental authorities can avoid this problem altogether by making it very clear, like provinces in particular can make it very clear in the legislation that empowers municipalities to expropriate and empowers municipalities to zone. They can make it clear that municipalities can zone without needing to pay compensation, even for really, really restrictive downzoning. So statutes like the Municipalities Act or the Urban and Rural Planning Act that empower municipalities to implement land use zoning and maybe restrictive land use regulation. If provinces amend those statutes to make it very clear that zoning for conservation purposes, even if it fully restricts a landowner's private property rights, does not require compensation by municipality, then the common law of de facto expropriation doesn't even really come into play, because the province has acted very clearly in its legislative capacity to oust the common law. So that's something for municipalities to keep in mind. If they're concerned about this, they can advocate to the provincial government to say, you know what, we need some more clarity and certainty around this. And in order for us to make proactive, prudent decision-making with respect to land use planning, you need to help us out a little bit by getting rid of this risk that the common law poses. So I would emphasize that as something that municipalities ought to consider as they're weighing the complexities in this area.
Cool. That's very interesting to me because I have zero understanding generally of law stuff. So thank you so much for that. I think the explanation was sort of necessary to get anywhere in our minds. And thanks again just for being part of this event. It really adds a lot. I think it's this side of it, I think a lot of people have a lot of questions and there generally aren't a lot of answers. And even like the information we get is not, straightforward. That's the way it is. And it's just good to have an understanding. So thanks so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Next, I'll go to Joel. And what I wanted to talk to you about was how throughout your time doing the things that you do, how you've noticed or how you've had to adapt your communication strategies and how you think they could still evolve, and how what you've learned in your space can be applied to people in municipal positions to try to convey this information in a way that gets people on board, doesn't paralyze everyone. Because that came up in the breakout rooms quite a bit, like, well, we need buy-in. You know, we already have trouble getting on the same page with trivial issues. So how do we move forward with this big stuff? And yeah, that's what I'm hoping you could speak on, the communication piece.
Right. Okay. So I think there's a couple of things in there, right? So if you're living in a community and you're trying to get buy-in for an adaptation plan, I think that's a communicating with your constituents kind of discussion, right? And I think those challenges exist regardless of what the plan is. People don't particularly want to change things if they don't have to. And so the key message here is communicating to people that yes, change is in many ways necessary. And it's not just about climate change, it's about a lot of things. But also recognizing that anytime you try to change things, you're gonna get a lot of pushback, you're gonna get a lot of resistance to that change. But when people end up seeing those changes, often that resistance disappears, right? Once you see that it's actually beneficial to you, or it hasn't dramatically ruined your quality of life, you start to become happy with the changes that get made. I mean, I can take a look at any kind of discussion about, say, for example, biking infrastructure in major urban centers in the West and North America, et cetera. As soon as that biking infrastructure shows up, a lot of the time, a lot of the original complaints disappear. Still get some people who are frustrated that they're being forced to share roads, but a lot of the residents around the regions where we get that infrastructure built, frankly, enjoy having it there to a degree that perhaps they didn't anticipate it originally. So yeah, sometimes it's about recognizing that you're going to get pushback. You might not necessarily have constituents that are happy with all the decisions that are being made initially, but that doesn't mean that when the changes are implemented that people don't get on board. So it's kind of about choosing what messages to hang on to when you start asking for feedback. If you're a constituent, if you're an elected official as well, I'd stress that you don't necessarily need to be out there. In fact, you shouldn't be out there trying to convince people of the climate science, right? I mean, I've had a couple of elected officials come to me and say, well, how do I communicate climate science to my constituents? My answer is, you're an elected official, you're not a climate scientist. That's not really something you need to be worried about. You need to point to the fact that you are paying attention to expert evidence from people who understand this kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, that communication piece is important, but that's sort of more for us scientists to think about. How has my actual communication changed? We're constantly adapting our messaging to what we're hearing in terms of resistance, right? So, I mean, if I think about discussions that I had around climate science and climate change back in the early 2000s, I would have a conversation with a stranger and they'd ask questions like, well, okay, climate change, is it really happening? And then they'd follow up with questions like, well, but how can we really know whether it's us that's creating this climate change? And so that's a certain type of discussion where you say, okay, here's a bunch of evidence. This is why we believe this. This is how we know what's going on. And this is why we understand this to be the only plausible explanation we have. By the time we got to the 2010s, the kinds of resistant conversations that we had were more, or the conversations that would sort of lead towards an action, stopped asking questions about whether climate change was real and started saying, okay, we understand it's real, but we don't think we have enough information to act on it yet. So we're not going to do anything. And that's a different type of response where you have to start saying, well, you already make a lot of decisions with uncertainty, with large amounts of uncertainty. You can make decisions with uncertainty regarding climate change as well. Engineers, for example, constantly use IDF curves for design criteria, and they don't think about the uncertainty in the quantification of that IDF when they're making those planning decisions. But if you introduce climate change and say, and here's the uncertainty, they say, well, I don't have a single number, I can't make a decision around this, or at least that's what they used to respond with. We make decisions with uncertainty all the time. This is sort of what Joe was alluding to earlier on. I'd say that these days, what I'm hearing when I get pushback on climate action, or people saying, well, I don't know what to do, is I feel paralyzed by it, or even worse, I've heard people saying to me things like, well, climate change is already going to happen, so I'm not going to think about it anymore. I mean, that's really self-defeating approaches to this particular problem. And I guess my response to that has shifted these days. to stressing that, yeah, we still have options. We still have actions that we can take. It's important to start taking those actions now. And it's important to start recognizing that if we aren't taking action that matches the scale of the problem today, then we are basically selling out the future of the next generation, right? So yes, I don't know. I'm trying to these days communicate that the urgency is there. We're running out of time, but that's not a reason to be hopeless, right? That's not a reason to feel like we're powerless in the situation. Instead, it's a call to action, right? We can't stop dithering around with small solutions when we need to start thinking much more holistically. And there's been a couple of discussions this last week that have really emphasized the importance of that. I mean, Ashley was talking yesterday about taking sort of coordinated climate change responses into consideration when planning everything. It's not just the domain of one particular elected official. It's not the domain of a particular city employee. It's something that we should be incorporating together into all of our planning, full stop. I mean, that's the kind of scale of response that is necessary, particularly as we start to rethink the cities that we've developed over the last few decades, the lifestyles we've developed, and recognize that those ultimately can't be continued into the future if we're actually going to get this problem under control, right? So to think about how we're moving through our cities, how we're designing those cities to allow different types of movement, how we're living our lives, what we're consuming, and what policy decisions and design decisions allow us to do in terms of making choices, right? If I built a city like St. John's without adequate public transportation, and I've designed a bunch of communities that require you to drive everywhere to basically buy groceries, work, etc., we're forcing certain types of decisions on people, and we need to start undoing some of those choices. And again, that requires a sort of coordinated rethinking of how we're designing our cities going forward and how we can reshape what's already being designed. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince people who have not come on board that climate science is legitimate and that climate change is really happening. Additional scientific information isn't going to shift people who are still sitting there on the fence, despite the wealth of evidence that this is happening and it's our fault. But I will continue to change my messaging about the need for action to match the kinds of objections that I bump into. Does it make some sense?
Very much so. Yeah, and well, I brought it up because it ties in with what we were seeing in the breakouts, where it very quickly, when you're talking about these issues and the solutions, it gets emotional. Whether you're anticipating the reactions of others, other people on the council or the residents, or if yourself get this sinking feeling in your stomach, like, oh crap, like, what are we going to do? That's like, we have to deal with that. You can't really progress very far if you don't process that and then move on. The same as with any other type of grief, because that's sort of what it is. There's anticipatory loss is a word that was introduced to me, and that's sort of what's happening. Like, we know we still have our coastline, we still have our marina, and we still have our oceanfront property, but we know in the back of our mind that it's impermanent. And I think it's kind of the work of everyone as people to start to think about that and let yourself be sad for a while so that we can move forward.
Emotions absolutely understandable and frankly necessary. And you brought up grief as one thing. I mean, yes, aspects of our environments have already effectively been lost. They're still there, but given the amount of climate change that we've already committed to, change is inevitable. Some of the things we see today are going to be gone. And there's really no going back on that. And grieving, that's important. Yes, absolutely. What I'd say though is that we still have time to scale the problem back, right? To really deal with the mitigation part of climate action, to make sure that that loss doesn't snowball, right? Doesn't persist, that we don't lose more than we necessarily have to. And so, yeah, I think grief is important, but I'd also really these days, and this comes up a lot. This came up this last week in a different presentation for the Vital Signs release. I hear a lot of people saying it's important for us to have hope, and that's absolutely 100% true, right? If you don't have any hope, you're not going to move forward. But I think at this point, it needs to come with some other emotions as well, right? So when somebody dangles a little bit of hope over here that is not the correct scale for the challenge that we're facing, then we need to point to that and say, okay, yes, I understand there's small steps forward, but we need to do much more. And we need to balance that hope with will and probably a little bit of anger. So, you know, I was at a presentation this week where we talk about 1 meter of sea level rise potentially happening across this island. And then a couple of slides later, we're talking about indications of steps forward and innovation that's going to get us out of this. And they're bringing up locally made thermostats as an example. And I can't help but look at that and say, you're talking about 1 meter of sea level rise on the one hand is the problem, and thermostats, literally thermostats as a solution. And I got to say, like, that's inadequate, right? We have to recognize that that's too small a solution. That kind of presentation doesn't give me hope. That leaves me feeling like we've completely lost sight of the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And so we need to constantly push back on that kind of thing and recognize that something bigger than thermostats has to be done. And if we're going to deal with this problem, if we're going to deal with this crisis, we're frankly going to have to recognize that the lifestyles we currently live aren't sustainable. We need to start actually giving something up and not waiting for technology to come along and just replace what we've been doing with new technologies. That's a hard ask, but it's the unfortunate reality of the climate crisis, right?
Yep.
So yeah, anyway,
Perfect,
emotions
yeah.
necessary.
Mhm.
Bring me your anger. Please bring me your anger.
Yes. All right, perfect. I will go back to Kathleen now. And we have a few minutes left, so we'll just try to tie this all together again. My question is, we've talked a little bit about regionalization and how that ties in with stuff, with general resiliency, emergency planning, these concepts of managed retreat and relocation and shifting stuff around, development and conservation. So, and this kind of started to come up with Joe, but regardless of where we are in terms of finalizing regions, what the province decides and all of that, how can we start to take this approach now and regionalize our thinking?
Well, it's interesting. We're as close as we've ever been, you know, to the provincial government moving on regionalization. MNL was party to a working group last year and the year before that produced a regionalization report. There was a preparedness on the part of government to entertain it. They got into the budgetary process, and that's kind of where, yeah, radio silence has ensued. So we haven't given up entirely on that front. It seems to be the logical next step in so many respects. So don't give up altogether. That's the regionalization piece is still one of MNL's major strategic planks. As an advocate for the municipal sector in this province. But otherwise, we can look at the circumstances of municipalities. There are a lot of not all of them necessarily are supported by actual contractual agreements and what have you, but there are a lot of collaborations that exist across our sector and across the regions within the province already, and particularly in, I would suggest, the emergency preparedness sphere. I see that often as the entry point for a lot of that sort of conversation in lieu of regional government these days, because we do have, for the most part, some sort of fire department or firefighting capacity, in most every community across the province. And in that context, we also have mutual support and aid relationships between communities. So quite conveniently, I think we have a circumstance where, particularly where so many of the actions that we're seeing in the national adaptation strategy right now are pinned in that first category of disaster resilience. I think there are some real opportunities for us there to be animating and consolidating some of those networks. These are also quite conveniently the organizations that have generally worked together on their emergency planning. The province has not been really doing much in the vein of supporting the updating of municipal emergency plans for a number of years now. This is a standing irritant for a number of folks that work as first responders. We'll perhaps want to look at a lot of the sort of vulnerability assessment, rollouts as things that, can really step off from some of the folks that are already perhaps involved in those cohorts of first responders, and, who perhaps have a more systematic approach to a lot of these things, and quite conveniently actually already do have a fair bit of their own data. Fire departments in particular are, sort of paramilitary like organizations. They keep records, they have standard operating practice, they do drills, they work in these spaces where oftentimes we can also forward conversations around asset management a little bit better. So yeah, there are a variety of things we can be doing there. Municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, as the federation of the elected municipal governments in this province, has worked on a number of fronts to be able to support these processes. We have, as you probably heard, a brand new CEO starting up in the new year. He's very interested in supporting the climate resilience of communities in the province. So I think we'll be doing a lot more work in this space in order to ensure that some of the collaboration that perhaps is not necessarily supported right now by regional government officially is nonetheless supported otherwise.
Great. That's all I have on my list. So if anyone has anything to add, a question in the chat or to raise your hand from any participant here, or if someone on the panel is itching to say something else, now is a chance. We've covered a decent bit in this short time. Hopefully it all makes sense and is relevant to you in some way. We're having some nice conversation in the chat here about how we can channel our feelings. I'll add here now, we do have a survey prepared to get your feedback on this workshop experience. I'll put it in the chat now, but there's no pressure to do it immediately. If you want to think about it for a bit, let everything sink in for a week or so, that's fine. I'll send it out again in an email, but also if we're kind of cluing up here and you have this last 10 minutes to do it, you can get it out of the way. That would be good. It looks a little long when you click it. It's not actually that long. It's mostly quick multiple choice type things. Click, 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 done. But I do have the option for like comment boxes if you want to tell us some more. So hopefully you can spend as much or as little as time as you like and still give us some decent information, because we are quite curious about your thoughts. It's our first time organizing something like this, so we're trying to learn as much as we can so we can do this again even better. Anyone have anything else to add?
Just to say thank you to everyone for attending and coming on this journey with us. It's been really wonderful for us and for everyone who stuck it out the whole week. Good job. Thanks very much.
We very much appreciate it. And of course, like we very much relied on some attendance to get through the breakout rooms and all the discussion we hoped would happen. And we did see a bunch of that. So that's all because you showed up. So that is it for me. take that survey link if you like now, or wait for me to send it out again. The entire conference proceedings might take a little bit of time for us to put together, but we'll send it all out, the slides and the chat and all of that stuff, and extra resources that came up in links and things like that. Any questions at all, let us know. I'll put my email in here just so you all have it if anything comes to your mind. And that's it. So thank you again. Hopefully we'll do something similar again another time.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Oh, and thanks to all the facilitators. We asked a lot of them and they were always there with our last minute changes and reviews and everything. So thanks again for that.
Thanks so much. It was great.
Glad to hear that. Thank you.